No United States, no British Empire, no Renaissance as we know it. Instead, one empire, unbroken, ruling from London to Baghdad for over 2,000 years straight. For 1,000 years, Rome was the world. Then it collapsed. And everything we call modern history is really just the story of the world rebuilding itself out of that wreckage. But what if it never collapsed at all? Before we imagine the alternate timeline, let's be clear on how the real one ended. Because the fall of Rome is actually too false. By 85 AD, the empire had gotten too big for one man to govern. So it was split into a western and eastern half. The Western Roman Empire, the one with Rome itself, started crumbling under pressure from every direction. Economic decline, political corruption, a bloated and unpaid military, and wave after wave of migrating and invading groups, including the Goths, Vandals, and Huns. The symbolic end came in for 76 AD, when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. No dramatic final battle, just a quiet changing of the guard that historians only later recognized as the end of an era. But here's what most people don't know. The eastern half didn't fall. It survived as the Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, for another 1,000 years, finally falling to the Ottomans in 1453. So, in a very real sense, Rome's story didn't fully end in 476. It just shrank. So, for our what if, let's imagine a divergence. The Western Empire stabilizes in the 4th century, stronger emperors, successful military reforms, a fairer tax system that doesn't bankrupt its own farmers. The empire holds together, East and West reunify under strong administration, and Rome never fractures. What would the next 1,500 years actually look like? First, no Middle Ages as we know them. The collapse of Rome triggered centuries of fragmentation in Europe, warring feudal kingdoms, collapsed trade networks, and the loss of huge amounts of engineering and administrative knowledge. If Rome holds, the collapse never happens. Roads, aqueducts, sanitation, and centralized law continue evolving instead of being rebuilt from scratch 1,000 years later. Second, Christianity still likely spreads. Rome adopted it in the 4th century either way, but it develops as a state-managed religion under continuous imperial oversight rather than splintering into the fragmented, locally controlled churches of medieval Europe. Fewer centuries of religious civil war, but also far less religious diversity and dissent. Third, technology. This is the big one. Rome high concrete, aqueducts, early steam experiments, the Yalapal, advanced roads, and complex bureaucracy. Some historians argue that without the Dark Ages bottleneck and unbroken, Rome could have reached an industrial-style revolution centuries earlier, potentially hitting an 1800s level tech tree by the year 1000. Fourth, no age of exploration as we know it, or a very different one. Columbus sailed partly because Constantinople fell in 1453 and cut off Europe's eastern trade routes. If Rome never falls, that trigger never happens, meaning the discovery and colonization of the Americas could unfold completely differently, potentially centuries later, under a unified Roman banner instead of competing European nations. Now here's the part that really breaks your brain. There might be no United States at all, at least not the one we know. The USA's founding is downstream of a very specific chain of events. Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, British colonialism, and European nation-states competing for territory. Nearly all of that stems from Rome's collapse and the fragmented, competitive patchwork of kingdoms that followed. A unified, unbroken Rome likely means no fractured Europe, and no fractured Europe means no British Empire launching ships to colonize North America in the 1600s. Instead, global power might still be centered in the Mediterranean, a single continuous superpower, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf, acting as the world's dominant economic and military force for 2,000 uninterrupted years. Instead of dozens of competing nation-states, you might have one empire with regional governors, Similar to how the US has states today, except the United States would just be provinces of Rome. Language would look different too. Instead of English dominating global business and diplomacy, a modern evolved form of Latin could be the world's lingua franca. So, better world or worse? Let's weigh it honestly. The pros. Centuries of pointless European wars likely never happen, since there's one government instead of dozens of competing kingdoms. Knowledge and engineering never get lost and rebuilt from scratch, meaning technology could be significantly further along today. Trade networks remain stable and continuous across 3 continents instead of collapsing and reforming over centuries. The cons. A single empire lasting 2 years means far less political experimentation, no democratic revolutions, born from fighting against monarchy, because there's no fragmented monarchy to rebel against in the first place. Cultural diversity could be dramatically reduced, with regional identities slowly homogenized under centuries of centralized Roman rule. And history shows that empires this large eventually calcify, meaning corruption, stagnation, and slower innovation over time, even if it never technically falls. There's also the darker side. An empire that never faces a true collapse also never faces true reform. Slavery, for instance, deeply embedded in Roman society, might have persisted far longer without the destabilizing events that, in our timeline, eventually forced its abolition. So maybe Rome's fall wasn't just a tragedy. Maybe it was necessary. The collapse that painfully forced humanity to reinvent itself into something more diverse, more experimental, and ultimately more adaptable. Rome gave the world its foundations, but maybe it had to fall for the rest of the world to be built. If Rome had never fallen, would humanity have reached the stars by now? Or would we still be ruled by a single emperor? That's next week's What If. Subscribe to IFverse and I'll see you in the next timeline.